I wonder if we could talk a little bit about something you mentioned with regards to what is the dating of Revelation. So I think there's two
important
options.
question, right?
Remind us again what you were telling us and why does it matter?
So there, two main options within, I would say, at least conservative evangelical circles. And there was another slide if you want to put that up here. So some people who opt for the early date say the book was written in this is the one with the emperors, if you pulled that one out. Some people opt for the early date, which was the 60s. There you go on the left if you're watching it. In the 60s.
Nero's nose is something.
Dude, I
wonder how accurate that
these guys were
is.
not good-looking guys. I was looking for busts and statues, and these were some of the other ones made them look really bad. But anyway, so the early dating would be the 60s, and Nero would have been the great persecutor of the church, persecutor of Christians, throwing Christians to the lion's den, literally in the arena. And if you're somebody who takes more of a preterist view on Revelation, I think you have to take that early date because you're seeing much of the book as being fulfilled in the first century, leading up to that destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, which we talked about quite a bit with the Olivet Discourse over the summer and Luke 21. The other one...
and sometimes when you read the Bible, like deciding the date of writing doesn't affect the interpretation that much. Right. You can kind of go with a couple different options. In this case, this decision actually does have an impact in terms of how you're going to interpret other sections of the book.
Right. So obviously, if you don't opt for the early date, if you opt for the later date, which I would say is probably the majority opinion, this was written late first century, 80s, 90s, under the Emperor Domitian, then you can't really take a preterist view of Revelation. You're looking more at some futuristic aspects of the book, at least throughout church history and maybe beyond. So the emperor who was emperor in the 80s and 90s was Domitian, and now it's debated about how much he actually persecuted the church. Some people say he did. Others will say, well, the persecution did not come from Domitian. It came from more of the local provinces and this group called the imperial cult that was actually trying to infiltrate the churches of the first century, which may be why John offers that writing to the seven churches. So think about it more. It's like the federal government is not persecuting you; it's the state. So the state of New Jersey is coming after you, and your local municipalities are coming after you, as opposed to the federal government. That was sort of the debate about how much Domitian was bringing the persecution versus others, and he may have been. I'm not sure that he was really a friend to Christians, but was he feeding them to lions like Nero? We don't know. So those are the two options for dating. If you're really liberal, some people will put it later on in the 2nd and 3rd century, but that's not us. These are the two options for conservative scholars. You got some papers over there.
Well,
I got some thoughts on this date, man.
I'll just add to it. Some people may not be interested here. Skip to the next section of the video. But if you are interested in the date and why people would decide what they decide, sort of the earlier date is usually based on internal evidence, and then the later date is usually based on external evidence. And so in favor of the early date, there's a couple things of internal evidence. Number one is chapter 11 of Revelation seems to describe the temple in a way that depicts it as still standing. It says, go measure the temple. So if there's no temple, if it's already been destroyed, then that chapter is hard to interpret, though you can get there, but it's challenging. Another thing with the internal evidence in terms of the early date is this whole number 666. And so right. There's a way to interpret that with gematria. So
that's not going to be a barcode on your head.
Some people think it is. Some people think this is a more natural number that John's readers would have been able to figure out. He says this calls for wisdom, and I think he expects anybody who's like reading the book of Revelation to be able to figure that out. So there's people who say if you look at the name Nero Kaiser and then you take the letters and turn them into numbers and then add them all up, the name Nero Kaiser in Greek actually adds up to 666. And so because of that, people say, well, this is referring to Nero. Other copies of Revelation, actually our earliest copies of Revelation, have the number 616. Dan Wallace, who was one of my professors at Dallas Seminary, says 616 was not the name of the beast. It was the neighbor of the beast who lived a few doors down, which is a joke for you Bible nerds out there. But actually what it was depending upon what language you're speaking, if it's Greek, it's 666. If it's Hebrew, it's 616. And so the reader could figure it out depending upon the audience. So sometimes the translator would change the number. Or I should say that it's backwards. I think it's in Hebrew is 666 and then Greek is 616. Anyway, so Bruce Metzger, who's a famous textual critic, says that that was an intentional variation of the book of Revelation so that the readers could better figure out, hey, he's talking about Nero, the guy who persecuted the Christians, the guy who I think killed his mom, the guy who castrated that boy and then married him, the guy who set fire to Rome and then blamed it on the Christians. That lunatic is the 666 beast that Revelation 13 is talking about. If so, Nero reigned in the 60s, and I think he died in 68, so they would say probably an early date. The other passage is in Revelation 17, verses 9 through 11, where John says the 7 heads are 7 mountains. And you know how New York is called like the Big Apple? Like we have like nicknames for cities. Like,
Right.
what are some other nicknames? Like Chicago is like the Windy City. Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love.
The Big Easy.
The
I believe
Big
is
Easy.
New Orleans, right?
Yeah. So there was a nickname for Rome, and it was this city on 7 hills because they built the city on 7 hills. And in Revelation 17, it says that these 7 heads are 7 mountains depicting Rome, and then there's 7 kings. Well, if you count the kings, if you start with Julius Caesar, you go Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, Tiberius, that's 3, Gaius is 4, Caligula is 5, Claudius is 6, and then the 7th is Nero. So Nero would be the 7th emperor. So Revelation 17 seems to be saying that what we're talking about is the 7th king, the 7th emperor of Rome. So that's another piece of internal evidence that people say the early date is probably the most accurate date. So some people believe that. And then if that's the case, then they see most of the book talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the coming judgment upon them, that the harlot is riding the beast. The harlot is the nation of Israel that's apostate, that has rejected Christ. And then you remember how the high priest, used the authority of Rome to kill Christ in some ways. So that's the harlot riding the beast of Rome to conspire together and crucify the Lord of glory.
Okay.
So that's the preterist way of seeing it.
So would they still see Revelation 19, 20, 20? Those are still future.
Yeah, typically those chapters would still be yet to come in the future. The second coming, the millennium, the new heavens and new earth. But then, the parts in the middle there, they say, are talking about AD 70. So that's the internal evidence. There's counter arguments for all of that. So that's what some people say, though. Now, the external evidence for the late date is there's a guy named Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of John. And there's a famous quote by Irenaeus, I'll read it here in his book, Against Heresies, where he says that John received the revelation almost in our time toward the end of the reign of Domitian. So this is Irenaeus, who probably would have known when Revelation was written, who seems to be saying that Revelation was written in the reign of Domitian. Now, he may or may not have been right. We don't know. Or there's another way to interpret this statement that says that not so much the revelation was seen during that time, but that John was seen still alive during the reign of Domitian. So that's one way to say it. I can see I'm really exciting Bob here with this great information.
I'm not on camera. You're not to mention that.
So the other thing about people, they say the late date is they say those churches, like in Revelation 2 and 3, some of them are in steep decline. Like Ephesus has lost its first love. Noah preached about that. Has there been enough time for Smyrna and for these other churches to decline in their spiritual vitality by the mid-60s? I mean, they were just planted, in the early 50s. So the later date gives those churches more time to decline and be in the state that they're in by the time they're getting sort of rebuked a little bit by John in Revelation 2 and 3. So
if it was an early date, basically those churches would have just started
like
recently.
church plants.
Yeah, they're still in the infancy stages.
Right. Now, there's answers to that, but those are sort of some of the arguments. And there's good godly scholars on both sides. I think the early date has some pretty compelling evidence, but I also see the late date as being relevant too. Both dates really apply. Both dates were written during times of persecution. Both dates have incredible relevance to the original readers and to us who are reading it today too. So, yes, it matters for your interpretation, but it's the book is still very relevant and valid no matter what date you choose. Okay. That's the end of the date segment. Thank you for
welcome back.
enduring.
Those of you that skipped ahead, missed out on the history section.
Wake up! The date section's over.